It's 1912, and the world's oldest continuous civilization just witnessed something unthinkable. After over 2,000 years of imperial rule, China's last emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Pu Yi, has abdicated his throne. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, crumbled like an ancient wall, finally succumbing to time and pressure. But here's the thing about China. It's like that friend who goes through a dramatic breakup and then spends the next century completely reinventing themselves. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're a mess, but they're never boring. What happened next would be one of the most chaotic, bloody, inspiring, and transformative periods in human history. We're talking about revolutions, warlords, world wars, civil wars, famines, economic miracles, and the rise of a superpower that would challenge the entire world order. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into the entire history of China after the dynasties collapsed. If you think Game of Thrones had political intrigue, wait until you hear about Republican China. And if you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most fascinating transformations, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. So, buckle up, because we're about to explore 110 years of Chinese history that reads like the most ambitious historical drama ever written.
Let's start at the beginning. When the Qing dynasty fell in 1912, it wasn't like flipping a light switch. Imagine trying to steer a massive ship that's been on autopilot for thousands of years. Suddenly, everyone wants to grab the wheel. The man who initially seized control was Sun Yat-sen, often called the father of modern China. Think of Sun Yat-sen as China's George Washington, except his revolution was way more complicated. He had spent years in exile, studying in Hawaii and earning a medical degree, all while plotting to overthrow the imperial system. Sun Yat-sen had this beautiful vision called the 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. Sounds great on paper, right? It was like China's Declaration of Independence and Constitution rolled into one. The idea was simple: create a modern, democratic republic that could stand alongside Western powers as an equal. But here's where things get messy. You know how when you're renovating a house, everything that can go wrong usually does? That was China in 1912. Sun Yat-sen quickly realized that having good ideas and actually implementing them in a country of 400 million people were 2 very different things. Enter Yuan Shikai. And this is where our story takes its first dark turn. Yuan was a powerful military leader who essentially pulled a political coup. Imagine if your friendly neighborhood general decided he didn't like democracy after all and wanted to be emperor instead. That's basically what happened. Yuan Shikai had Sun Yat-sen step aside and became president himself. But Yuan wasn't satisfied being president. In 1915, he tried to declare himself emperor. It was like watching someone win the lottery and then immediately try to rob a bank. The backlash was swift and brutal. Yuan died in 1916, probably from stress, and his death opened the floodgates to chaos. What followed was the Warlord Era. Think of it as China's version of the Wild West, except instead of cowboys, you had military strongmen carving up the country like a birthday cake. From 1916 to 1928, China was essentially a failed state. Different regions were controlled by different warlords, each with their own armies, currencies, and rules. Some of these warlords were relatively benevolent, focusing on developing their territories. Others were basically medieval tyrants with modern weapons. Zhang Zuolin controlled Manchuria and lived like a king. Yan Xishan turned Shanxi province into his personal kingdom, and actually did some good work modernizing it. But then you had characters like Zhang Zongchang, who was so notoriously corrupt and brutal that people called him the dog meat general. During this period, the Republic of China existed mainly on paper. There was a government in Beijing, but it changed hands so often it was like musical chairs with deadly consequences. Between 1916 and 1928, there were over 40 different cabinets. Imagine trying to get anything done when your government changes every few months. But here's what's fascinating. Even during this chaos, Chinese society was transforming.
The May 4th movement in 1919 was like China's Cultural Revolution before the Cultural Revolution. Students and intellectuals were demanding science, democracy, and modernization. They rejected traditional Confucian values and embraced everything from Marxism to pragmatism. This was when figures like Hu Shi promoted vernacular Chinese literature, when women started demanding equal rights, and when young Chinese intellectuals began seriously studying Western philosophy and science. It was messy, but it was also incredibly creative and dynamic. Think of this period as China's awkward teenage years, full of experimentation, rebellion, and trying to figure out its identity in a rapidly changing world.
Now, while China was fragmenting into warlord territories, two political movements were quietly gathering strength that would define the next century of Chinese history: the Kuomintang, KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. The Kuomintang was Sun Yat-sen's political party, reorganized with Soviet help in the early 1920s. Yes, you heard that right. The Soviet Union was initially helping both the nationalists and the communists. It's like a geopolitical love triangle that would make reality TV producers jealous. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, and leadership of the KMT eventually fell to Chiang Kai-shek, a military officer who would become one of the most controversial figures in modern Chinese history. Chiang was like that ambitious middle manager who suddenly finds himself running a Fortune 500 company. He had the drive and the ruthlessness, but maybe not all the skills needed for such a massive job. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921, and among its early members was a young librarian and teacher named Mao Zedong. Now, Mao in the 1920s wasn't yet the revolutionary leader we know from history books. He was more like a small-town radical who wrote poetry and organized peasant movements. Nobody could have predicted he would eventually become one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. Here's where the story gets really interesting. From 1924 to 1927, the KMT and CCP actually worked together in what was called the First United Front. Their goal was to reunify China and kick out the warlords. It was like a political buddy cop movie, two very different parties working together toward a common goal. Chiang Kai-shek launched the Northern Expedition in 1926, a military campaign to reunify China, and it was remarkably successful. His armies, advised by Soviet military experts and joined by communist forces, swept through warlord territories like a hot knife through butter. By 1927, they had reached Shanghai and were on the verge of controlling most of China. But then came the plot twist that nobody saw coming, except maybe Chiang Kai-shek himself. On April 12, 1927, Chiang suddenly turned on his communist allies in what became known as the Shanghai Massacre. Imagine working on a group project for months, and then right before the final presentation, your partner tries to eliminate you from the group. That's essentially what happened, except with machine guns and thousands of deaths. Chiang had decided that the communists were becoming too powerful and posed a threat to his vision of a unified China under KMT rule. In Shanghai, Canton, and other cities, KMT forces rounded up and executed Communist Party members and labor leaders. It was brutal and effective. The Communist Party went from a growing political force to an underground resistance movement overnight. This betrayal would define Chinese politics for the next 22 years. The communists who survived, including Mao Zedong, fled to the countryside and began building rural base areas. They realized that the Chinese Revolution wouldn't come from the cities, as Marx had predicted, but from the vast peasant population that made up 90% of China. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek established his nationalist government in Nanjing in 1928. For the first time since Yuan Shikai's death, China had a unified government at least on paper. The Nanjing decade, from 1928 to 1937, is often seen as the Republic of China's golden age. During this period, China experienced significant modernization. New roads and railways were built, modern banking systems were established, and there was genuine economic growth. Cities like Shanghai became cosmopolitan centers that rivaled Paris or New York. If you've ever seen old movies set in 1930 Shanghai, with its Art Deco buildings and jazz clubs, that's the world Chiang Kai-shek was trying to build. But here's the problem. China in the 1930s was like a house with a beautiful facade, but serious structural problems. Most of the population were still desperately poor peasants. Corruption was rampant. And there were these pesky communists in the countryside who refused to go away. Chiang became obsessed with eliminating the communists. He launched what he called encirclement campaigns, essentially military operations designed to surround and destroy communist base areas. Between 1930 and 1934, he launched 5 of these campaigns. The first 4 failed, but the 5th was different. Chiang brought in German military advisors and used modern tactics to slowly squeeze the communist areas. By 1934, the main communist base in Jiangxi province was on the verge of collapse. What happened next became one of the most legendary episodes in communist history, the Long March.
You're facing complete annihilation, so you decide to walk 6,000 miles through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. That's essentially what the Chinese communists did in 1934 when they began the Long March. About 80,000 communists broke out of the Jiangxi encirclement and began an epic journey that would take them across rivers, mountains, deserts, and through territory controlled by hostile warlords and nationalist forces. It was like the world's most dangerous hiking trip, except instead of Instagram photos, you had to worry about air raids and starvation. Only about 8,000 people completed the entire march, but those survivors became the core of the Communist Party leadership. The Long March wasn't just a military retreat, it was a transformative experience that turned the communists from a regional rebel group into a hardened revolutionary force with a powerful founding myth. It was also during the Long March that Mao Zedong emerged as the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Think of it like an extreme team-building exercise that revealed who really had what it took to lead. But while the Chinese were fighting each other, a much bigger threat was building in the East. Japan had been expanding its influence in China since the late 19th century, and by the 1930s, Japanese militarists were ready for full-scale conquest. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, a small skirmish that escalated into total war. Japan's invasion of China was swift and brutal. Shanghai fell after months of devastating urban warfare that gave the world a preview of what modern war looked like. Then came the fall of Nanjing, and with it, one of the most horrific atrocities in human history. The Nanjing Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanjing, saw Japanese forces systematically murder hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war. It was a level of organized brutality that shocked even war-hardened observers. This event would scar Chinese memory for generations and explains much about China's later relationship with Japan. Chiang Kai-shek's government fled first to Wuhan, then to Chongqing in the remote mountains of Sichuan province. Meanwhile, the Japanese occupied China's richest and most developed regions, the entire eastern seaboard where most of the population and industry were located. Here's where the story takes an ironic turn. The Japanese invasion actually saved the Chinese Communist Party.
Chiang Kai-shek was forced to stop his anti-communist campaigns and focus on the Japanese. Even more importantly, the war created conditions that played to communist strengths. While the nationalists retreated to the remote interior, the communists established base areas behind Japanese lines. They perfected guerrilla warfare tactics, hitting Japanese supply lines, then melting back into the countryside. Mao Zedong famously said that guerrillas should move among the people like fish in water, and that's exactly what they did. The communists also began implementing land reform in areas they controlled, giving peasants the land they had always dreamed of owning. Meanwhile, they portrayed themselves as the most patriotic and effective fighters against the Japanese invaders. From 1937 to 1945, China endured 8 years of devastating war. Entire cities were destroyed, millions of people died, and the country's economy was shattered. But the war also unified Chinese resistance against foreign invasion in a way that hadn't been seen since the Taiping Rebellion. The United States began supporting China after Pearl Harbor, seeing Chiang Kai-shek as a key ally against Japan. American General Joseph Stilwell was sent to advise Chinese forces, though his relationship with Chiang was famously difficult. Stilwell thought Chiang was more interested in hoarding supplies for use against the communists than fighting the Japanese, and he wasn't entirely wrong. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, China was supposedly one of the victorious Allied powers. China even became one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The country was devastated, the economy was in ruins, and the underlying conflict between nationalists and communists was about to explode into the open.
If you think the previous decades were chaotic, buckle up, because the Chinese Civil War was like the ultimate season finale of this historical drama, except it lasted 4 years and determined the fate of a quarter of humanity. When Japan surrendered in 1945, both the nationalists and communists rushed to accept Japanese surrender and occupy as much territory as possible. It was like a massive game of Risk, except the stakes were control of the world's most populous country. The Americans, led by General George Marshall, tried to mediate between the two sides and create a coalition government. There were peace talks, ceasefires, and genuine attempts to avoid civil war. For a brief moment in 1945-1946, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, China could avoid another devastating conflict. But it was not to be. Both sides were convinced they could win a total victory, and neither trusted the other. By 1946, full-scale civil war had resumed. On paper, Chiang Kai-shek looked like the sure winner. His nationalist forces outnumbered the communists by about 3-1. They controlled all the major cities and had massive American military aid. We're talking about $2 billion in military equipment and supplies, which was enormous money in the 1940s. The nationalists also had international recognition and controlled the official government. If this were a betting game in 1946, smart money would have been on Chiang Kai-shek. But the communists had several crucial advantages that weren't immediately obvious. First, they had learned invaluable lessons about guerrilla warfare during 8 years of fighting the Japanese. Second, they had genuine popular support in many rural areas because of their land reform programs. And third, they had developed a highly disciplined, ideologically motivated fighting force. Most importantly, they had better leadership. While Chiang Kai-shek tried to micromanage military operations from his headquarters, imagine trying to play a strategy video game with terrible internet lag, communist generals like Lin Biao, Chen Yi, and Liu Busheng were given operational flexibility and had extensive combat experience. The turning point came in Manchuria. The Soviets, who had occupied Manchuria during their brief war against Japan, quietly handed over Japanese weapons to the communists while officially maintaining neutrality. The nationalists poured their best troops into Manchuria, trying to hold the major cities, but found themselves trapped in an increasingly hostile countryside.
Lin Biao's communist forces gradually encircled and destroyed entire nationalist armies. The Liaoshen campaign in 1948 was a masterpiece of military strategy. The communists isolated nationalist forces in urban pockets, then systematically eliminated them. By the end of 1948, the nationalists had lost their best-equipped armies and most of Manchuria. But the real disaster for the nationalists came with the Huaihai campaign in late 1948 and early 1949. This was one of the largest military engagements in human history, involving over 1 million soldiers on both sides. The communists, now calling themselves the People's Liberation Army, surrounded and destroyed the remaining elite nationalist forces. What made this victory even more remarkable was that it was achieved largely with captured nationalist equipment. The People's Liberation Army was essentially re-equipping itself with American weapons taken from defeated nationalist units. It was like watching someone win a boxing match using their opponent's own gloves. The psychological impact was devastating. Nationalist morale collapsed. Entire units began defecting to the communist side. Chiang Kai-shek's government, which had seemed so powerful just a few years earlier, suddenly looked like a house of cards in a windstorm. By early 1949, communist forces were crossing the Yangtze River, China's traditional north-south boundary, and marching toward Shanghai and Nanjing. The nationalist government began preparing for evacuation to Taiwan, a large island that had been returned to Chinese control after Japan's defeat. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. His famous words, "The Chinese people have stood up," marked not just the communist victory, but the end of what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation, the period from the 1840s to 1940s when China was carved up by foreign powers. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek and about 2 million nationalist soldiers, officials, and civilians fled to Taiwan, where they established what they claimed was the legitimate Republic of China government in exile.
Now we enter the Communist era. And if you think the previous periods were eventful, the next 3 decades would see China attempt the most radical social and economic transformation in human history. It's like watching someone try to rebuild a car while driving it at 100 miles per hour. When the communists took power in 1949, China was essentially a medieval agricultural society with some modern cities. About 90% of the population were peasants, literacy rates were around 20%, and life expectancy was only about 36 years. The new government faced challenges that would have overwhelmed any administration. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party had big dreams. They wanted to transform China into a modern, industrialized, socialist society that could stand as an equal to the United States and Soviet Union. Think of it as the ultimate national makeover show, except the stakes were the lives of 500 million people. The first few years were actually quite successful. The communists implemented land reform nationwide, redistributing land from landlords to peasants. This was enormously popular with the rural population, who had been dreaming of land ownership for centuries. They also launched literacy campaigns, established basic healthcare systems, and began large-scale infrastructure projects. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was the first major test of the new regime. When UN forces approached the Chinese border, Mao decided to intervene, sending hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteers to fight alongside North Korea. It was a costly war. China suffered enormous casualties, but it established the People's Republic as a major power willing to challenge the United States. By the mid-1950s, China had achieved political stability for the first time in decades. The economy was growing, social reforms were being implemented, and there was genuine optimism about the future. If the story had ended here, we might remember Mao Zedong as one of history's great nation builders. But Mao was not satisfied with gradual progress. In 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward, one of the most ambitious and ultimately disastrous economic campaigns in history.
The basic idea sounded reasonable enough. Accelerate China's development by mobilizing the entire population for rapid industrialization and agricultural modernization. Mao believed that human willpower and revolutionary enthusiasm could overcome any economic or technical obstacles. The reality was tragically different. Imagine trying to turn your entire neighborhood into a steel-producing factory overnight, with no real knowledge of metallurgy or industrial processes. That's essentially what happened across China. Backyard furnaces sprouted everywhere. Peasants were ordered to melt down pots and pans to produce steel that was completely unusable. Local officials, terrified of disappointing Beijing, reported wildly inflated production figures. Mao, surrounded by yes-men and isolated from reality, believed the optimistic reports. He even exported grain to other countries to demonstrate China's success, while rural areas were actually facing food shortages. The Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961 was the deadliest famine in human history. Conservative estimates suggest that between 15 and 30 million people died from starvation and related causes. It was a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented scale, made worse by the fact that it was entirely man-made. What makes this tragedy even more poignant is that it could have been prevented. When Defense Minister Peng Dehuai tried to warn Mao about the disaster unfolding in rural areas, he was purged as a right-wing opportunist. Local officials were so afraid of being labeled counter-revolutionary that they continued reporting bumper harvests even as people were dying of hunger in their districts. The Great Leap Forward finally ended in 1962, and more pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping took charge of economic policy. They implemented market-oriented reforms that allowed the economy to recover. For a few years, China seemed to be returning to a more moderate path of development. But Mao Zedong was not finished with radical transformation. He had been marginalized by his own party after the Great Leap Forward disaster, and he was planning a comeback that would shake China to its very foundations.